Imagine you're an astronaut floating in the International Space Station, looking out the cupola window, and somewhere out there in the dark, a cloud of metal fragments is silently spreading toward you at 17,000 miles per hour.
And the thing is, that's not a hypothetical anymore. That's the actual situation right now because another Starlink satellite just broke apart in low Earth orbit. Second time in 3 months.
Second time in 3 months. And here's the twist: the same week this happened, SpaceX quietly filed for what could be the largest IPO in the history of the stock market. So we've got debris flying and billions of dollars on the table simultaneously.
Which, honestly, kind of captures the whole SpaceX story in one sentence. Breathtaking ambition and genuinely unnerving risk coexisting in the same news cycle.
Let's start with the debris, because I think people don't fully appreciate how serious this is getting. On Sunday, a Starlink satellite suffered what they're calling an in orbit anomaly, which is a very clinical way of saying it just broke apart.
And Leo Labs, the space tracking firm, picked it up almost immediately. Tens of fragments spreading outward from the satellite's last known position. The debris field is real and it's growing.
Now, to understand why this matters, you have to understand the environment we're talking about. Low Earth orbit isn't empty space, it's essentially a highway. A very, very fast highway with no lanes and no speed limits.
Everything up there is moving at roughly 7 to 8 kilometers per second. So even a fragment the size of a marble has the kinetic energy of a hand grenade. The physics are brutal. It's called the hypervelocity problem.
And there's a concept called Kessler syndrome, named after NASA scientist Donald Kessler, where debris creates more collisions, which create more debris, until low Earth orbit becomes essentially unusable. A chain reaction that could trap us on our own planet.
Kessler described it back in 1978, and his scenario wasn't science fiction. It was math. The question was always when, not if, we'd start flirting with that threshold, and some researchers think we're already past it in certain orbital bands.
So here's what makes this particular incident so pointed. SpaceX doesn't operate a handful of satellites. They operate the world's largest constellation, over 6,000 Starlink satellites currently in orbit, with plans for tens of thousands more.
Which means, statistically, SpaceX has more skin in this game than anyone. More satellites means more chances for something to go wrong. And 2 breakups in 3 months is a pattern, not a coincidence. Engineers would be deeply worried about that.
We don't know yet what caused the anomaly. Was it a hardware failure, a software glitch, a micrometeorite strike? SpaceX hasn't said. And that silence is almost as unsettling as the event itself.
Though to be fair, investigating an in-orbit failure is extraordinarily hard. You can't exactly send a technician up there with a multimeter. You're working from telemetry data and guesswork, trying to reconstruct what happened from 1,000 miles away.
That's a fair point. But here's where the story gets really interesting, because while the debris was still spreading, SpaceX was doing something else entirely, filing confidentially for an IPO with the SEC.
And not just any IPO. Bloomberg is reporting this could be the largest initial public offering in history. We're talking about a valuation that could dwarf even the biggest tech listings we've seen. Saudi Aramco's IPO raised $29 billion in 2019. This could go beyond that.
Let that sink in for a second. A rocket company, a company that literally blows things up for a living, intentionally, could become the biggest public market debut ever. That is a wild sentence to say out loud.
What's fascinating is the timing, though. The confidential filing means we don't see the prospectus yet. They're not legally required to disclose until closer to the actual listing, expected in June. But filing now sends a signal to investors and sets the clock ticking.
And there's a question I keep coming back to. What does it mean for SpaceX to go public? Because right now, Musk can make wild bets, accept huge losses, pivot on a dime. Public shareholders tend to want boring things like profits and predictability.
That tension is real. Look at what happened to Tesla after its IPO. Years of volatility, Musk fighting with analysts on earnings calls, shareholders demanding accountability. SpaceX going public could fundamentally change how the company operates under pressure.
Although, and I want to push back slightly, SpaceX has actually built an enormously profitable Starlink business. This isn't a moonshot startup burning cash with no revenue. They've quietly become a real company with real margins.
That's exactly right, and it's probably why the IPO is even possible right now. Starlink has millions of subscribers, government contracts, defense partnerships. It's the financial engine that funds everything else. Starship, Artemis, the whole vision.
Which brings in the Artemis connection. NASA's countdown clock actually started ticking for Artemis 2 the same week SpaceX set a new launch record. There's this sense that everything is accelerating at once, almost uncomfortably fast.
And Artemis Tikkut is significant because it's crewed, the first humans to fly around the moon since 1972. SpaceX is deeply embedded in that mission, so the debris incidents aren't just a PR problem, they're a safety concern for human spaceflight programs that depend on a clean orbital environment.
Now let's zoom out for a second, because I think there's a larger pattern here that's genuinely worth sitting with. Every great leap in transportation history, railroads, aviation, the early internet, created exactly this kind of moment: incredible capability, inadequate oversight, and a race to capitalize before the rules catch up.
The railroad barons come to mind: transformative technology, real public benefit, and also monopolistic behavior, safety shortcuts, and regulatory chaos, all at the same time. We eventually got the Interstate Commerce Commission. Space will eventually get something equivalent.
And then there's the XAI piece, which adds another dimension to this whole Musk empire story. All 11 of XAI's original co-founders have now left the company, every single one. And Musk himself says the company is being rebuilt from the foundations up.
Which is a remarkable thing to say about a company you're about to take into the biggest financial moment of your career. It either means radical reinvention, or it means something went seriously wrong internally, and he's putting a positive spin on an exodus.
Right? And the question is whether investors pricing that SpaceX IPO are also pricing in the Musk risk. The fact that his attention and his reputation are spread across rockets, electric cars, an AI company in turmoil, and a deeply polarizing political role.
Markets are going to have to decide how much of SpaceX's value is the technology and the business, which are genuinely excellent, versus how much is the Musk aura. And those two things are starting to come apart in investors' minds.
So here's where I land on all of this. SpaceX is doing things that are genuinely, historically extraordinary. Setting launch records, building the infrastructure for human expansion beyond Earth. That's real. But extraordinary ambition creates extraordinary consequences. And that debris field is the consequence no one wants to talk about.
My takeaway is a bit colder. 2 satellite breakups in 3 months, a massive IPO filing, and an AI company losing its entire founding team, all in the same week. That's not chaos. That's what it looks like when a single person is trying to move faster than institutions, markets, and physics will allow. Something eventually has to give.
And maybe that's the real story here. Not just SpaceX's triumphs or its troubles, but the profound tension at the heart of this moment in history. We are genuinely reaching for the stars. The only question is whether we're building the ladder carefully enough.